once you find your sources, once you've evaluated your sources and determined these sources are going to be useful to me, these sources are not going to be useful to me, so I'm going to put them aside, then the next step, of course, is to begin thinking about how am I going to use these sources? How am I going to bring them as to a part of my paper? Well, there are a couple of things to think about with respect to using sources. Why do you use sources in a paper or a research project? Well, one has to do with the issue of credibility. If you are trying to develop a credible research paper, you're going to use sources because you're lending credibility. It's not just what I think, but here are other people that say similar things. You use sources to support your claims. So, for example, I'm writing a paper and my argument is going to be that the woman taken in adultery passage belongs in John chapter 8. And here's why I believe it, and here's some information to back that up, information I've gathered from sources that supports the claim I made that it belongs in chapter 8. Perhaps it's not just support, it might be to reinforce your claim. This is the scholarly position on this subject. Right? Look at all these people who have said this. Now, just because you find a number, 500 scholars say this, doesn't make it true or not. But it does help reinforce other things that you are saying. And finally, we use sources because it fits us into a community of scholarship. And it's a recognition that when we work on research projects or when we're in a specific field, that we need to be conversant with others in that field. And so being a part of the community of scholarship is an important aspect of all of this as well. So these are the reasons we use sources. When do we use sources? Because obviously, when you produce a research paper, for example, the professor is wanting to see your work, not just you copying a source, right? Here's this source, here's this other source, right? So you have to use sources judiciously, and you use them in certain ways. First, you use sources when you want to demonstrate a point, right? And so you're making a point, and so here's a source that kind of demonstrates my point. I'm trying to say something about a theme in Paul's letter to the Romans. One of the themes is faith versus works. And so I'm going to now give you a scriptural verse from Romans that demonstrates my point. Right? So you're using the source to demonstrate a point. You might use a source to substantiate a claim. So, for example, if you want to say, Paul uses the term faith X amount of times in the letter to Romans, and then I give you scriptural citations. And I've used I've used that source to substantiate how many times Paul uses the word faith. You use a source to provide an example. That would be another way to think about it. Or to assert authority. I'm trying to demonstrate that a particular group of scholars who have spent a long time studying this have come to this conclusion. Right? So here's the authority. So there are certain reasons to use sources, there are certain times to use sources, but in thinking about the process or how you use sources, there are a couple of things to recognize as well. We've already talked about the idea of critical thinking in research. And so you have to be careful in how you use sources for a couple of ways. First of all, you don't want to plagiarize. And we'll talk about academic integrity next week. And so you have to use the sources carefully. You have to use the sources in such a way that you're conveying credit where credit is due. You're conveying what this person said accurately. You should use sources with respect. Even if you disagree with what a particular source said, you should still be respectful of that individual. Right? Not calling them names, not saying, well, this is a ridiculous idea, but using respect. Of course, using or giving credit appropriately, well, that has to do with academic integrity, as we talked about. And then finally, we need to recognize that sources should support what your project is, not be the main part of it. If all you're doing is telling me what's in other sources, you're not really doing research and you're not really doing anything I could do myself in the same amount of time, or maybe less. Right? So remember, you're using sources to help make your claim, not just to transfer or transport facts from one place to another. When you approach your sources and think about incorporating them, it's very important that you read your sources critically. That entails some things we've already talked about already. First, you need to evaluate your sources. As we've already talked about, paying attention to, is this a credible source? Is this a scholarly source? Is this a person that has expertise? Having done that and say, okay, this is a reliable source, then you want to kind of skim the source and say, is this really going to be useful to me or not? And so, for example, you're doing a paper on a specific text of the Bible. So I find a commentary on that biblical book, commentary on John. And so I want to see, is this going to be a useful commentary to me or not? So I'm flipping through, looking at the passage that I'm studying. And if your commentary, even though it's a commentary on the biblical book, doesn't have much, if anything, about your passage, it's probably not going to be useful. So move on. Right? Don't take the time to waste much of your effort with this source if it's not going to be useful. Having determined that it's useful, then you need to do a thorough and close reading of that source. Right? Taking notes, paying attention to what's being said, things that we'll talk about further along. One thing to make sure you don't do is what's known as rating a source. I just find something and I'm like, oh, that's a really interesting phrase. I pull it out and I don't pay attention to how that's being used. I don't pay attention to how, any sort of caveats or anything related to that. So, use sources carefully, critically. Make sure you're paying attention to what's being used or said. But then also, as you determine, okay, this is going to be useful to me, you get down the full citation information. Right? And we'll talk again next week about citing and all the information you need. But that's something very important to get down as you are examining the source. So, let's say you find a source on a online scholarly database, and you download the PDF, and you read through it and say, okay, oh, this is really great. Great information here, and this is going to be very important in my paper. And what journal is this from again? Because the PDF may or may not have the information on it. So you want to make sure that as you go to any source, you have the full citation information. That might be, if you find sometimes you might find a chapter in a book that's going to be useful, but the entire book isn't going to be useful, and so you decide to photocopy or scan the chapter. If you don't scan that title page, you may forget where you got that book from. So make sure whenever you get a source and are determined it's useful, you get all of the information that you need for citation. You also want to be very careful with your documentation. Making sure you have the information that you need, making sure that as you are taking notes, perhaps you find a commentary and you decide you're not going to photocopy the particular pages that you're interested in, you're just going to take notes. In doing that, you want to be careful that you note in your notes whether or not what you're writing down is a direct quote, whether it's a summary or paraphrase, so that when you incorporate it into your paper, you do so properly. And so if you have written down exactly what that source said, or you've copied it into a Word document, when you put it in your paper, it needs to go in quotation marks. Otherwise, you plagiarize technically. If it's a paraphrase, then you want to be careful and not put it in quotation marks, because that's not what that source said. It's your take on what that source said. So be careful in how you document the information you're discovering in these sources. When it comes to incorporating sources in your paper, then, there are a couple of things, or a couple of ways that can be done. First of all, though, it's important to recognize, as I've said before, don't let the sources dominate your paper. We'll talk more about this in other places. But what should predominate in your paper is your voice. It should be your interpretation of the information, which means that you shouldn't have these large blocks of quotations from other sources. Some of those might be appropriate in certain situations, but predominantly it is your voice that needs to be the clearest in research papers. So don't just let those sources, quote, 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 quote. Yes, you might feel like a little intimidated, right? Well, these people have been studying this for so long. That's fine. And that's, people that are professors recognize you're not experts in the particular field. But it's still, I want to hear your take on this information. So don't let that predominate in the source. Or excuse me, don't let your sources predominate in your paper. But when it comes to incorporating sources, there are essentially three different ways to incorporate a source. First is quoting. Quoting refers to putting the information from your source in the exact words used by that source. Now, sometimes that might mean quoting several sentences. Sometimes it might mean just a few words. Sometimes you might find something where there are several sentences here together. The first sentence is good, the second sentence is good, but I don't need this stuff in the middle. So you can use ellipses, which are the three periods. Right? So you quote the first sentence, put 3 periods, quote the second sentence. And that lets your reader know, okay, there's more that was in this source, but this is what is the important part. Summarizing is another way to incorporate information. When quoting, we're using the exact words. Summarizing, we are putting it into our own words, and usually it is shorter. And so a summary is going to be shorter than the original source. But it's also important to recognize that you still must cite that information. So even though you've put it in your own words, you originally got it from some other source, so you must cite that information. But you don't need quotation marks. A third way to incorporate information is through paraphrase. Now, paraphrase can be shorter or it can be longer. The length isn't necessarily the difference. But essentially what you're doing is kind of, let's say, translating the information from your source into your paper. Here, too, you need to cite the information, right? So you're such and such scholar said, I'm not putting it in their words, I'm putting it in my words, right? Paraphrasing it, right? Citation at the end. And so you're kind of translating what's in a source into your own words for paper. However, you need to be careful that you don't change the tone when you're paraphrasing. Because there could be something in your original source that it's not a major point. Right? Your source is just kind of it's a side note. But if you say this scholar asserted that such and such, when it was just kind of a mention, you're kind of changing the tone of what that scholar is trying to do. Right? So in your paraphrasing, be careful on the words you use to paraphrase.